everyone, and welcome to episode 44 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you're anything like me, one of the most exciting things to look forward to every year is the brand new books that come out. 2019 was a great year for books, as my shelves can attest, with new biographies, histories, and primary sources galore. So before we turn the page on this year, and this decade, I invited Peter from Medievalist.net to sit with me at the kitchen table to talk about some of our favorite books from the past year. As you'll hear, my dog George decided to make an appearance as well. All right, so hi Peter, we're going to talk about the books that we liked from 2019, right? And you've got 3 picks all ready to go, right?
Yes, I do, Danièle.
Do you want to start? What's awesome from 2019?
Okay. Well, my first book is called The Apple of His Eye, Converts from Islam in the Reign of Louis IX, and it's by William Chester Jordan. William Chester Jordan is like one of those really well-known big historians, like Hall of Famer, you'd say. And he's worked a lot on like St. Louis, and this is his latest work. If I was going to make like my list of like a book of the year, this would be number 1 because I think it's a fairly important kind of piece. It deals with Louis going on the 7th Crusade, and while he's there in like the Near East, he is able to convince hundreds of people to convert from Islam to Christianity, and he decides to bring them all back to France. Up until this book came out, like people knew this story, but they thought it was a really big exaggeration or it was just kind of didn't happen. But he was able to kind of go through like civic records, like figure out that these people were brought back to France and settled in all sorts of towns throughout northern France. So you'd have little communities of converts. So maybe 4 or 5 households in this town, stuff like that. And he talks about what the French government was doing to kind of support this group, what kind of reactions there might have been from the population. But it was really fascinating uncovering this aspect of religion and ethnicity, because these are all people coming from the Middle East that are now having to settle in France, where there's snow and cold weather, different foods, things like that. So again, I thought it's a really good work that I think that a lot of historians will want to have as a reader of, like, this is a kind of a slice of life in the medieval world. Kind of runs the gamut of a lot of, from religion to history to Crusades. So lots of things to talk about here.
So is it the type of book that if somebody is not a scholar, they could just pick up and read?
Maybe not, because the work is based on a lot of other kind of research. You don't get like too much about Louis himself or like about the Crusades. So you probably have to have some background in that. But it is a fairly easy read. Jordan's a really good writer. This was something that he spoke about at conferences before, so I've already had like a kind of whet my appetite for reading this kind of piece. But it's something I think you'd have to have a little bit of background. But I think our readers here on Medievalist.net, we'd be a fairly easy read for them. So.
Okay. So what is it that you like about the book? Do you like the way that it's written? Do you like the way it's researched? What is it that makes this your topic?
I think it was the way it was researched. Basically, like Jordan takes a look at records that other people have said, no, these are fictional elements, or these are talking about Jewish converts. But he starts piecing it together. And I really always kind of like that when you kind of go through the records and start weaving a little tapestry that brings out this kind of story. So, and to me, that's always the kind of best kind of research, when you kind of uncover something new. So that's how I like it.
Yeah, it's a good story, because I think that it kind of goes against what people think about the Middle Ages being like completely white, especially places like rural France. And then you have actually these converts in the middle of rural France that are put there. So I think it's a really good story in itself.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the kind of the themes that I've kind of been seeing around 2019 in the medieval world is integration and cross-cultural patterns. So you see that this is a very clear example of how people in the medieval world are getting together with each other. So this is a really kind of a nice kind of book for that.
Well, good. I'm glad that you picked that one because I think that is a bit of a game changer when it comes to books, and it's a new one out this year, so that's a good one. I'm going to talk about a couple of the books that I've picked are ones that I talked about on the podcast already. So if you're interested in those, you can go back and listen to the interviews that I've done and pick up the books yourself. So the first one that I want to talk about is Books Before Print, which is Erik Kwakkel's book. And he's such an amazing scholar when it comes to manuscripts and how books were put together before the printing press. But the thing is that, like you were saying about William Chester Jordan, like Erik is just a great writer, and so his stuff is really accessible. And when you think about manuscripts, you think about this being something that like only scholars can really understand, and it's only really worthwhile to scholars, but that's not the case with Erik's work. In fact, he became a bit of a rock star on the internet at first because he was talking about medieval manuscripts and doodles and stuff like that, and people have an interest in that. And so his book, he just explains everything really well, and he has, you know, the pictures and all the scholarship to back him up. And he's aiming this at the undergraduate level. So I think anybody will have no problem with this book because he explains all the terminology. You don't need to know anything beforehand. And so much about what we know of the medieval world comes from manuscripts and having them put together. It's good to know how they were put together and what this meant. So Books Before Print would be one of my picks. I don't have them in a particular order, but it would definitely be one of my picks. So that's the first one I'm going to go with, Books Before Print by Erik Kwakkel. So
I think like one thing is that manuscripts have been kind of in vogue the last few years. People are kind of taking new appreciation, especially because a lot of them are being digitized. That you can be read through online. And Erik does a wonderful job kind of, telling us some of the intricacies of what like a manuscript is and he has this, wonderful kind of social media presence as well. So yeah, it's a great guy.
Yeah, I think that manuscripts are in vogue in part because of Erik's work, because it's something he made it accessible for people on the internet with his pictures. He learned how to take pictures so that he could take really good pictures of manuscripts, and they are really good, and he's got a whole bunch of them in the book as well. So yeah, I think that manuscripts are popular because of Erik and because he makes it very accessible. So I think this type of book that would appeal to everybody. So that would be my first pick to talk about today. So what do you have up next, Peter?
I have up next, it's called Norse Greenland, Viking Peasants in the Arctic. It's by Arnved, and I'll try and get this, Nedkvitne. Again, you can see where I kind of like, I always like going into these corners of the medieval world, and there's no further corner than Greenland. Basically, the kind of story is just before around the year 1000, it gets settled. About 1,000 people arrive from mostly from Norway. That population kind of grows to about between 2,000 and 3,000, but it exists for about 400 years. This place that's very isolated from even the rest of Scandinavia. Like it's basically most people that go there by accident. So it's the story of how this community, which is really on the outskirts of the Norse civilization, does well for itself over 400 years, and then it kind of mysteriously collapses and goes away. So there's been a lot of research over the years looking at Greenland, but this is, I think, the first real book that kind of pieces it all together. And I was just surprised at how much research he was able to tell us about the daily lives. You get stuff about how it acted as this kind of pre-state, where it's basically on its, like Iceland, it's on its own until the 13th century. But then, it's under the control of Norway and Denmark, which doesn't mean much, to be honest. So, we have a bit about trading, about religion, and then he kind of explores the idea of what actually happened in the 15th century. The settlements basically disappear. One popular kind of theory out there is this is ecological. This is something to do with climate change. He actually it goes more with the idea that this was actually war with Inuit that led to the downfall of and like the whole Greenland population getting wiped out, and he kind of points to kind of various evidence. Again, it's a really fascinating book that I really enjoyed.
That's really interesting because, well, I don't know a lot about the Norse, to be honest. But it's really interesting that there's a story that has them in possible war with the Inuit. That's really cool.
Yeah. Like he's able to. There's lots of kind of little bits of evidence. Like there's even like the Inuit have stories of them going to Greenland and fighting off or attacking the kind of Norse settlers. And just he kind of goes into explaining, well, why could this happen? Like the Inuit just had more resources, more they were able to kind of develop a better war, and the Greenland peasants are really on their own because they don't have any real support from, at this point, Denmark to kind of fight off any wars. It's a very compelling kind of story.
And I think that's really good too, because it's worthwhile paying attention to the oral histories of the Inuit, because people have not been paying attention to the oral histories of the Inuit to their peril. We know this in terms of like Canadian history, people finding it's the Franklin, I think, that was sunk up north, and people didn't believe the Inuit about where this ship was. And of course it was exactly where the oral stories had said. So I think that lending credence to the stories, oral stories of the indigenous people, I think is a great idea for scholarship.
And it's also another way we're looking at cross-cultural movements and where they come together. In this case, it's not a very peaceful one, but we do have the Norse trading with the Dorset people, and there's other archaeological evidence to kind of show that why. So that's part of that story as well.
That's good. It sounds like a good recommendation. So is this the type of book that you can just pick up at the store and read without any background?
Yes, I think it's the way he kind of writes it is very much very small bits. Like basically, if you look at his table of contents, there's like a new subheading every 2-3 pages. So you might want to say pick up like, hey, did Norse people go to church? You can start off there. But yeah, I think this is actually a fairly easy read.
I'm glad. That's a good one. And I think we're getting a wide range of things that you can read about as well with our picks for 2019. The next one that I want to talk about, again, I did a podcast on this, and I probably wouldn't have read it without the podcast, but now I'm really glad I did. And that's The Making of Measure and the Promise of Sameness by Emanuele Lugli. And again, I spoke with him. That was a really, really interesting conversation. And I do think this is a book I highly recommend, because so he's talking about measurement and how people decided on how to measure things, and then how they did measure things. And I mean, measurement, as he says in the book, is one of these things. It seems invisible to us. It seems like it's natural. It's not anything that, people tend to think about from day to day. But these were constructs that people came up with, how to measure length, how to measure weight, how to measure volume, that kind of stuff. And it's hugely important to every part of society. Like, he's looking at Italy for the most part. But I mean, we're talking about trade with every part of the world, having to figure out what these standards are for measurement and how you decide, which ones are we going to go with for this in particular. And so Emanuele, he really he gets at this in a way that makes a lot of sense. It's not the type of prose that is the type that you necessarily find easy to read if you're not an academic. It's a little bit of a higher level than you usually see with popular history. That said, it's a really readable book. And so I think that I would recommend it to pretty much everybody. Again, it's not the type of Wars of the Roses type story that you find people who like the Tudors, for example, will read. But it's the type of thing that if you need to know or want to know more about the actual details of the medieval world, it's really, really important. And so, I mean, scholars need to read this stuff, because, I mean, how many people actually know anything about how measurements were done in the Middle Ages, even if they're scholars of trade, for example. So I think that it's really important for that. But I also think it's so much more interesting than you might imagine when it's something about measurement. So that's another book that I would pick definitely for people to read is The Making of Measure and The Promise of Sameness.
Do you like books that kind of deal with kind of this minutia of daily life, of these kind of like things that we kind of all take for granted, but there are histories to it, right?
I do tend to root for the underdog in general. So I do like these ones that get into minute detail, because I think that small things can have a huge influence. Like, for example, the way that you write a book actually on the parchment that you're writing on, like what kind of materials you have, will determine what kind of book it is, and that will determine what kind of readership it has, and that will determine, whether it survives for 1,000 years. So that kind of stuff is really important to me. But also things like the making of measurements, like when you're trying to decide how much land is yours and how much is your neighbor's, like these are things that are really important to everyday life. And so it's not just abstract anymore. It's actually things that influence people's lives on a daily basis. So I've always really been interested in daily life. And so having this research kind of fill in those gaps that we may not necessarily think about. Yeah, I do like those kind of books quite a lot. Again, I did a podcast on that one, so I would suggest that people can go and listen to Emanuele, because he's awesome to listen to, and then find out more about the book. I really do recommend this one as one of my top picks for 2019. So what do you have next, Peter?
My final book on our little list is called 50 Early Medieval Things, Materials of Culture in Late Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages. It's by Deborah, Deliyannis, Hendrik Day, and Paolo Squatriti. And so it's, I'm a big lover of lists on medievalist.net, as you probably know. And this kind of book is in the kind of same vein. This book is in kind of the same vein as there's 100 objects that changed the world, just the kind of like looking at different artifacts and seeing their difference. So basically, again, this is very similar. You get like a couple of pages describing some kind of 5th century object, 9th century object. So we have everything from kind of works of art to chestnuts. But again, it's one of those things where I think anyone can kind of pick it up and just want to flip through it, look at kind of some beautiful imagery, and learn little bits about just objects and what their importance was in early medieval world.
Is there one of these objects that's particularly memorable for you?
There's all kinds of different objects, like you'll see like the Book of Kells in here, but one I really liked was the Gokstad ship. It's out of Norway, dates back to around the year 900, and just again, it's one of the pieces that's well known for, like, if you explore like images of the Norse world, the Viking ship is very memorable, and this is just a beautiful example. And it's in a museum now. So, but again, a lot of these, there's various kinds of objects that, just reach out just for their beauty. So
yeah, and I think there's a theme with the stuff that you like. It's usually early medieval, and a lot of it is Viking Norse, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's like it's one of the kind of areas that like I kind of got interested in early on. I always found like the Norse world very complex. Lots of different things are happening. Great stories. The Icelandic sagas are fascinating for me. So that's kind of one area. And like I tend to kind of move off to corners of the medieval world. So like I don't spend too much time in Germany or France and things like that. And so I kind of like, my other kind of area is like the Middle East history. So and China as well.
Yeah, and that's why we balance each other out. So if we are sticking to 2019 exclusively, I think that a third pick that I would say would be Crusaders by Dan Jones, because I do think that we need to have popular history on this list as well. And Dan is just a great writer for people who are interested in the Middle Ages and they want a good story. And so again, I talked to Dan not too long ago about Crusaders, and he can tell you more about the book. But in general, he's telling stories about people who are not usually at the front and center of the Crusades. So instead of talking about Richard I, for example, he talks about Richard's sister, or other people who were around during the Third Crusade. And he introduces each of his chapters with a different person's story. And these are stories that cross cultural lines, they cross gender lines. So it's a good book to introduce people to the Crusades in a way that is not told the same way as everybody else. And so I think that's really important. I think that we need to look at Crusades, especially in this day and age, and we need to look at them from different perspectives. And so a popular history book that really hits that sweet spot, I think, is really worthwhile. And of course, Dan's prose is always really readable and enjoyable, and he always makes me snort. So I think it's worth recommending Crusaders as well.
There's always a ton of books about the Crusades that come out. What do you think makes a really good book about the Crusades? Like when we kind of take a look at that.
I think that many of the books that I've looked at about the Crusades, they focus only on things like the military aspect of it, and they focus only on the Middle East, and they focus only on the people who are leading the charge, right? They'll focus on the Templars, or they'll focus on like Saladin, or they'll focus on, just the people who are in charge. And I think that it's important to look at the people who are on the outside of that, because there's thousands of people who are involved in the Crusades, and they are not exclusive to the Middle East, and they're not exclusive to men, and they're not exclusive to just the people that we tend to see in these Crusader books all the time. So I think that if you're a scholar, if you're an academic, you're seeing more of these alternate histories of the Crusades. You're seeing more Islamic sources and stuff like that. But I think if you are just an ordinary person at the bookstore, you don't tend to see those things. And so to me, I would think you want to start talking about the Crusades with a book that gives you a wider view of them. And so that's why I like this book in general.
Like I've done a lot of kind of reading in the Crusades literature. So like a book like this is a lot of it I think I would know. So that's and I kind of jump into sources or particular books about particular battles, things like that. But I can see where this could be like if you're kind of starting your reading into Crusades, this could be a nice beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, my aim in my work on medievalist.net and on this podcast has always been to get people where they are. And so this is not a podcast that's aimed specifically at an academic audience. We do mention, William Chester Jordan, Emanuele Lugli. These people are important for academics to read as well. But I do think that there are people listening to this that are at the beginning, and I don't think they should start with academic Crusade literature. I think they should start somewhere that is a little bit more friendly and a little bit more wide-ranging, and that will give them the basis on which to build their knowledge of the Crusades. And I really, because so many people are learning about Crusades in a very black and white way, where it is, and this is something that Dan talks about, it's black and white, it's zero sum, it is like two cultures in a death match, and that's really not what the Crusades were. And so I'm recommending this book, like I said, kind of a gateway into learning more about the Crusades, and just it's an enjoyable read. That's why I'm picking this one. I have a bit of a cheat too, so I'm going to keep talking. And that is, I wanted to talk about a primary source because I think it's important that we hear the people of the Middle Ages in their own voices. And so this is a bit of a cheat because it actually came out in 2018, but that is the Works of Gwerful Mechain. And I'm no good at pronouncing Welsh, so we're going to give you links to these. But so this is a poet from Wales in the late Middle Ages, and she writes the most dirty poetry, and I just absolutely love it. I wrote an article for medievalist.net about this book, and it's just great because it teaches you so much, because it is a woman's voice, it's a Welsh voice, and it's somebody who's talking about the joys of sex, and I just think that is just fantastic. I call it dirty poetry, but I don't find sexuality to be dirty. She just talks about this in a way that is very explicit, but she gets at how much people actually enjoy this. We can't just look at medieval sexuality as being something about shame all the time. And I think that she really kind of blows the doors open on that. And so I absolutely love her poetry and recommend it to everybody. So it is the Works of Gwerful Mechain, and it's translated by Katie Gramich, and it's for Broadview.
There's this is kind of like a work that probably wouldn't get very much attention 30 or 40 years ago. It'd be like, shh, can't can't let this go out. Middle Ages didn't have sex, but it just it goes to show that there's a really variety of literature out there that talks about all aspects of life in the same way that our modern day. We talk about all aspects of society and life. And you can see there's medieval counterparts to it.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that the church had a lot of things to say about sexuality in the Middle Ages. And for people who haven't listened to the podcast with Eleanor Yanniga or the one with Ruth Mazo-Karas, definitely listen to those, because those guys know everything there is to know about it. But I think that because, again, we have this black and white idea that it's supposed to be marital sex because that is what the priests were telling us should be done. But obviously people are enjoying their lives, they're enjoying their bodies. And I really love this woman's voice where she is just unashamed about how much she enjoys it, how much she looks forward to it. And so, I mean, it's not for everybody because it is very explicit. But I think in terms of teaching us about the human beings of the Middle Ages, this is a great book. You don't have anything to say.
I got nothing.
Got nothing. I do recommend that. And if you want to have a taste of this book before you actually dive into it, you can find my article on medievalist.net, which we will link to, and you can have a look at that and see what it's all about. So, Peter, we were also going to talk about our reading lists for the winter break. I don't think either of us is actually going to have a winter break exactly, but we have some reading that we want to do over the holidays. So what do you have lined up to read over the holidays?
Yeah. I know I'm terrible in the sense I have about 50 books out from the library right now, but how many will I get through? Maybe a couple. So some things that I'm really hoping to read. I have a book called by Christine D. Baker. It's called Medieval Islamic Sectarianism. It's from ARC. It's one of their I think it's Past Imperfect series, these are really little books, which are perfect for me. And this again is just a small. It aims to, from what I've read so far, it's kind of being what was the Islamic world religiously during the Middle Ages, and I think the offering is going to be a lot different than I expect. Books like that, you can kind of go on the Wikipedia and get a real gist of what dates and things like that, but you can't get a more nuanced look from that. So I'm hoping this is going to kind of enlighten me a little bit on kind of various religious sectarianisms and differences and things like that, and what might be really like. So I've got that.
Yeah, the Past Imperfect series, I used to work for ARC for a while, and we picked these books based on who were the people who were really great scholars in these fields that could speak about these topics in a short way. So the Past Imperfect books are bite-sized, but they are really good scholarship, and they give you an overview of things so that, again, you can dive into it later. So yeah, that whole series is good. This one on Islamic sectarianism is going to be great. I hope you enjoy.
I've got that. I've got Guy Geltner's latest book. It's called Roads to Health, Infrastructure and Urban Well-Being in Late Medieval Italy. Again, this is going to be about how people are dealing with health issues, sanitation, things like that. And again, lots of daily life. Geltner's a person I've really enjoyed reading before. He wrote a book on medieval prisons, which I thought was really well done. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And my final kind of book is called The Song of Bertrand de Guesclin. It's translated by Nigel Bryant. And it's a translation of a primary source. In this case, this is about the story of this 14th century French knight. And we don't have too many works that kind of focus on kind of soldiers from the Middle Ages. We have a translation of a narrative about Boucicault's life and William the Marshal's life. So this, I think, is going to fit in kind of there. So lots of chivalry and fighting, I hope.
Yeah, Bertrand de Guesclin is a really important figure in the Middle Ages, and Nigel Bryant is a great translator. So it's a match made in heaven. So it's going to be good. Do you know much about Bertrand in general?
No.
This is gonna
again, it's I know he's just a guy in 100 Years' War, kind of rises through the ranks. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think he's, one of these people you could call one of the flowers of chivalry. So it's gonna be good, and I think it'll complement, what you know about other knights like William Marshall. See, Peter is not a 100 Years' War type guy, so this is gonna be really eye opening for you. That's not where you spend a lot of your time, is it?
Like I'm a guy that tends to really bounce around the medieval world, just part of the job, I guess. So no, I know a bit, about the story and things like that. But again, like the details, I don't know what really happens in 1390s France. So I'm looking forward to that.
It's going to be good. My reading list is skewing a little bit towards England this time, but that is coincidental. I mean, I do like learning about England. I do know a fair amount about it, so that's what kind of makes it exciting for me. So these books have come to me. You should know, as listeners, that publishers, they'll send stuff to me or they'll send stuff to Peter from medievalist.net, and we only talk about them if we like them. So so I'm going to read these books, and if I like them, then we'll see if maybe we can have these people on the podcast or that kind of thing. So my first book that I'm looking to read is called The Shadow King. It's by Lauren Johnson, and it's about Henry VI. I was a person who knew more about the 100 Years' War and less about the Wars of the Roses until Peter asked me to write for Medieval Warfare about the Wars of the Roses. So I got to know that pretty well. And Henry VI is the English king who was the son, obviously, of Henry V, and he was mentally ill. And so he's the king who had moments where he was just completely unaware of his surroundings or anything that was going on around him. When he was lucid, he was still very easy to manipulate. So he was a very unstable king, and he made that time a very unstable time. So I'm looking forward to reading this and seeing what Lauren Johnson has to say about his life, because I think that because he was a very ineffective king, people tend to just ignore him like they did at the time. And so I'd like to see what Lauren Johnson has to say about Henry VI. So that's my first one. The next one that I'm looking forward to reading is called Medieval Bodies by Jack Hartnell, and I'm really looking forward to reading this one. It's called Medieval Bodies, Life and Death in the Middle Ages, and it is about the corporeal body, what people thought of it. And I like that kind of detail because, again, that really speaks to me about daily life, how people cared for their bodies, what they thought of their bodies. And you'll know that if you look at my work in the podcast, and I'm interested in things like medicine and obviously sexuality, right? Because I've got Gwerful Mechain as one of my recommended picks. So Medieval Bodies is one I'm really looking forward to as well. And I'm being very ambitious here because I've got a stack. The third one that I want to look at is called Richard III, The Self-Made King by Michael Hicks. And this one is from Yale, and there's a lot of people that think this is a really good biography of Richard III. It's probably about time that I waded into the Richard III debate. So I'm going to read this and see what I think about that. I'm guessing there's going to be stuff about the princes in the tower there. We'll see that as well. Richard III, really good, interesting character. I mean, I came across him first in Shakespeare, and then he's become obviously so well known with the discovery of his body in the car park. So I'm really looking forward to that as well and getting to know that figure more. And then the last thing, because I always read novels alongside of history, I don't tend to read medieval novels that much because I do need a break from the medieval world. But I've challenged myself. I need to read my first Bernard, I should say. The Winter King is one that people keep saying I need to read, so I'm going to read that one. I'm telling you all on the podcast that I need to read that so you can keep me honest about it. So that is a novel that I'm looking to read over the break. So yeah, that's my stack.
You have time for fiction? My gosh.
No, I make time for fiction. I don't usually watch TV. It's because my brain needs a rest before bed, and I tend to read fiction at that time. But you don't read fiction as much as I do you?
I wish I did. It's been a long time since I actually sat down to enjoy a good novel. So, but the Song of Bertrand de Guesclin could be mostly fictional. So.
Yeah, I love those primary sources. You're going to enjoy that one. I think. I mean, Nigel Bryant, like I said, he's got a good way of translating that. It's very vibrant. So I think you're going to like that. So So you don't have any fiction on your list for the holidays?
No. I'll watch Star Wars.
There you go. That's medievalism, right? We've got Jedi Knights in it that are kind of reminiscent of the Templars, right? So we can call that medieval fiction, right? We're gonna call it that.
Yeah, I'll reach out there. So I'm. So yeah, I'll be skimming lots of books, and I know I just picked up a translation of the Annals of Saint Vast, so 9th century Carolingian stuff. So that's my kind of what I'm hoping to get before Christmas.
That's your light reading. Okay, are you going to tell us what's on the website? Have you got that all set up and ready to go?
Hey, before we do that, let's mention like the stuff that we've done, because we have books. I technically have a book, but you have a book out, so people should read that.
Yes, I do have a book. Came out in 2019, and it's Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction. Yes, and you've read it. What did you think of it? I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, it was okay. No, it was really great. I think if you want to get your start into the medieval world and look at daily life and like various aspects of it, yeah, your work fits the bill. So and I was actually really amazed. It was a great read. I enjoyed it, and I think you're good. First of many like awesome books.
Thank you. Well, I do have a couple of self-published books out. The 5-Minute Medievalist, 5-Minute Medievalist Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse. So this was my first trade book, and like Peter said, it really deals with daily life. And I was talking to Winston Black about his book on fact and fiction, and his book kind of skews medical and scientific, and mine kind of skews towards social history because, again, I've always been really interested in daily life. What was it like to actually live at that time? And so my book answers people's questions about that. And if you look at the table of contents, which you should be able to find on Amazon, you can see that it's questions. And my idea is that people can hopefully read it from start to finish, or they can just dip in and answer the questions they want answered and that kind of stuff. And one thing I don't think I've mentioned talking about this book over the course of the podcast is it has a lot of pictures in it, and I really worked hard to get pictures that would speak to people. So I have a lot of pictures from the British Library, for example, manuscripts, and I also have a lot of pictures from the Met Museum, the Cloisters in New York. And so it's got pictures of objects and it's got pictures of manuscripts, and so there's something for everybody in that book. I really deliberately wrote it that way so that you could learn more about the Middle Ages. No matter what your interest is, there's something for you in this book. So what did you want to say about your work then, Peter?
Well, I guess I technically have a book out. So we do special issues medieval warfare, and we did one this year called The Rise of the Gun. So, and Amazon has said that I'm the author. I'm actually the editor, but hey, I'm on Amazon, so that all counts. So, and so it was just again, we kind of took a look at gunpowder and guns and gunpowder and their kind of invention in the Middle Ages from China, spreading across the medieval world, and I have a great collection of authors that kind of deal with all aspects of that, battles, the technology of it, how it changed medieval society. So if you're interested in that kind of military history aspect, I would recommend my own book called The Rise of the Gun.
Who are some of the contributors to that book?
I've got Kelly DeVries, Clifford Rogers,
Kay Smith as well.
Kay Smith, Ruth Brown, others kind of like dealing with warfare in Italy, again in China as well, Japan, Stephen Turnbull. So yeah, nice. It's fun how you can get like all these kind of people together and write for you, just force them to write for me. So
yeah, and then say that you're the author, right?
Exactly. Yes, Amazon says I'm the author. It says by Peter Konieczny, so I'll take that.
And this book is currently available on Amazon and everywhere?
Well, I suppose, yeah, you can get it on Amazon. You can go through Carwin Sari Publishers, where you get medieval warfare. So it's not really available too much in stores. It's something it would basically, we kind of, a couple thousand copies of, and then sell it for the next few years online. So
yeah, I was thinking about that because I should mention that my book, Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, came out in the UK in the end of September, and it's now out in the United States as well. So you should be able to get it in lots of places. You should be able to get it in Europe. You should be able to get it in the United States. I think Canadians, we are some of the last people to get this book. It should be out December 19th, so that is very, very soon. And if you pre-order it, then you should be able to get it for Christmas. Fingers crossed. If not, like obviously shortly after Christmas. But it should be widely available now, or you can get it from the publisher, which is Pen and Sword History. So, what's on the website this week, Peter?
So thanks to our columnists, we had a good week because I'm busy with medieval warfare. But we have a piece on one of those great novels from the 19th century, Ivanhoe. So Sir Walter Scott and Gillian Pollock goes in and talks about that book. We also have a column on the White Ship disaster, which is a very famous event from the 12th century and changes like English history. So we have that on the website and more.
Sounds great. Thanks, Peter, for all the recommendations today.
Thanks. Nice to sit down and chat with you.
And the dog. If you love books, you'll definitely want to check out our Patreon page. There you can find subscriptions to Medieval Warfare magazine, and you can join our book club with Boydell and Brewer. All the action is at patreon.com/medievalists. For more book recommendations and reviews, as well as a whole lot more medieval goodness, you can follow medievalists.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, all over social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and may all your 2020 book wishes come true.